Hey, in this video we will be running through a C# program and converting that code to C++, porting it to a different programming language. So I'm in Visual Studio and I have this program that I'm just going to paste in here. It's a C# program, and I can kind of run through it and get the gist of what it's trying to do. So it's set up kind of normally, and it just has one function, the main function. All right, should be simple enough. It declares an array of a bunch of integers and keeps track of these other variables. A sum, so I think it's probably going to add things up, a maximum and a minimum that is going to calculate. So it looks like it's going to try to find the minimum and maximum values in that array. So now the first loop we get to goes through 15 indices, and each of those indices it uses to check this array variable and adds that into our sum. So 15, there's probably 15 of these values, that's my guess. And we're going to be adding that into the sum. So it's going to add up every one of these values. All right. It prints out the sum of all of those numbers, and then it calculates an average. It divides that sum by how many entries there were. So sum divided by 15 is going to give us the average. It's important here that it is using a floating point division, so you'll get a floating point answer. And then it prints out that average. Looks good. We have another for loop that goes through that array again, and it tells me it prints out the first number in the array that's less than 70. So if a number is less than 70, it'll print it out and then break exits the loop immediately. So it only gets to check one successful number that's less than 70. And when it finds one, then we're all done. And then in the next loop, print out any number higher than 100. So it goes through all of the values, all 15 values, checks to see if each value is greater than 100. If it is, then it prints out that value. And this particular code also prints AND on the end. So we'll see a number and a number and a number and I think at the end of this you're going to have an extra AND just sitting there. It's going to say and are greater than 100. It's fine, not a big deal. It's going to print a blank line, and then it's going to go through the loop, another loop, and find the smallest and the largest numbers in the array. So we have a minimum value, and if any value in the array is smaller than the minimum, then the minimum should get that value. So it stays the smallest value. Similar with the maximum. If any array value is greater than the maximum, then we're going to be assigning the maximum into that variable. So that will always stay the biggest number. And then we'll print out the largest and the smallest numbers, and console.readline will just hold the window open until we press enter. Sounds pretty good. Last question I have here is what is the initial value of minimum? If you start off minimum at, say, like -9,000, then it might stay -9,000 through all of this, and that wouldn't be good. So let's look up at the top. And it is picking off the very first value of the array to initialize this. So that's fine. Since this is in the array, there will be no weird issue when it actually goes and calculates that, that minimum or that maximum. All right, so let's get to work converting this to C++. First at the top, using system is not the syntax that we would use to include or import a module in C++. With the current version of C++ that I'm using, that's more a pound include job. So I'm going to include IOStream. I'm also going to throw in the using namespace standard, just so that I can type less. All right. Class 3. So in C#, everything needs to be in a class. There are no such thing as a free function just floating around. In C++, your main function has to be a free function. It cannot be in a class. So I actually need to remove this class because all it is a container for my main function. I'll get rid of that, and then the curly brace at the end. That looks good. And I will unindent all of that stuff. All right, static void main, string array args. So in C++, we don't want our function to be static. What static was doing there is making it so that it was, funny enough, ironically, independent of the class that it's in. It's just in the class namespace, but not a function of any particular instance of the class. And if we left static on there, it would change the meaning of main. It would mean that it's only restricted to this file, and no other file can see it. And that's not what we want. The entry point in C++ needs to be a lowercase m main. And then for command line arguments, those are technically optional. I could just delete them. And this is a perfectly valid signature for a main function in C++. But I do recommend that you always stick to int main, int argc, char star argv, square brackets. So we have a return value to tell the operating system whether we were successful or not in our program. You have the number of command line arguments, and you have these strings. This is a way of representing strings in C, an array of the command line strings. So that is the recommended way. And since now this is returning an integer, I should do that at the end of my program. Let's return 0 because that indicates that it was successful. All right, now in our main function, we need to declare this array. The syntax here is a pretty simple change. I actually like the C# syntax better because this is all together, all of the type information, int array. That makes sense. That makes sense to me. Int square brackets means it's an array of integers. In C++, though, it's a little different. Int is the stuff that's stored in this array, and then the fact that it is an array, the square brackets, comes after. Whatever. You have to get used to it. These other ones, these are valid C++, so no changes needed there. A lot of this code is going to work just fine because C and C++ and C# are very similar languages. This for loop is perfectly valid C++. And then console.writeLine, we don't have a console object, so there's no writeLine, but we can use cout. Let me do that. And don't forget to replace these pluses so that we can properly use this output stream object. Now, this was a console.writeLine call, which means that it has a new line at the end. So we should also end line so that it preserves that functionality. We're calculating an average here, and there's an error. So 15f in C# is a floating point value, but this is not valid syntax in C++. To have a floating point value, you have to have a decimal point. So I'm just going to do 15.0f. And then console.writeLine, all right. This one we know we can replace with cout. Make sure we replace the string concatenation with another one of these insertion operators, and it was a right line, so we should end the line at the end. Next loop. So this is all fine until we get to printing things out, which we know how to fix. Okay, looks good. This loop is very similar, except this is using console.write. It is trying to write it all on one line without new lines between every time it writes. So let's print that out and then not do an end line at the end. So that'll stay on one line. Console.write again, so no new line here. And then console.writeLine. This one is just to put a new line there. So we could just tag it onto the end here, endl, and that would be fine. Or we can do another one of these with just endl. And I'll do that just to do a more one-for-one translation. All right. This array looks fine. Nothing in here is specific to C#. And then we just print out another time. The largest number is, so this is a C# syntax we don't have, at least not for cout. This is an interpolated string where it's taking this value and plugging it in to that spot. So let me actually approach this differently. I could do it just fine, say break it up and put maximum and the smallest number is minimum, and that would be fine. That would work, but I want to do this a little differently. Try to preserve this interpolation thing. Let's say paste that as one of our options. So instead, I want to do a similar thing here. I'm going to use the C function printf. This is a formatted print function. It takes a string, a formatted string, and it can do this string interpolation, plugging in variables in these spots. So the syntax is a little gross, kind of yuckier, but I do %f for a floating point value and %f for another floating point value. And there are different symbols and different settings you can use to control how that gets printed out. Like I can do .2f, and it's going to say only 2 decimal points in my floating point value. Actually, now that I look at this, these are integers, so I should actually use %d for a decimal integer, a base 10 integer. All right, so that's the right way to do it. And if we're going to be using a new line, then we have to include the new line character, \n, at the end there. So that's how you would have to print things out in the C language all the time using this function. All right, and then console.readline, this is just meant to hold open the window, so I'll do a cin.get, and that should do it. Sometimes, depending on if you're like reading user input previously in your program, sometimes you'll need more than one cin.get, or you'll have to do something fancy in order to kind of clear the input stream and then do cin.get. But we can deal with that complication later. So now that that's there, this looks like it will all work. So let's try it out. All right, the sum of the numbers, we got that. The average of the numbers, okay, I'm going to trust you on that. First number less than 70 is 68. Yep. 101 and 103, those are the only numbers that are greater than 100. And we got the 101 and 103 and are greater, so saw that coming. And then the largest number, 103, and the smallest is 54. And just a quick scan, it looks right. Looks like it works. And probably the biggest indicator of success is that it compiles. It compiles at all and there are no errors. All right, thankfully. So that's an example of converting a C# program into a C++ program. There's a lot of stuff that's the same. Very similar syntax because they come from the same family of languages, the C family. But just some small details that are different, and most particularly printing things out in C++ is a little different. All right, I'll see you next time.